So according to messages like this, and this in the comments down below, the intros are getting a little cringy. And, you know, I have to agree about that one. Wait, is that actually how you thought it was gonna go? Get the fuck out of here, Pro Guide Sleeper Agents. What's up, everybody? Coach Mills here. And in this video, we're gonna be breaking down the biggest mistakes for every single role. Whether you're a duelist, initiator, controller, or sentinel, we have multiple tips for you so that you can iron out all your mistakes so that you can become a hyper impact machine and easily climb the ranked ladder. But do yourself a favor, go check out the GameLeap website in the links down below for in-depth advanced guides over every single agent, VOD reviews, tips and tricks, map guides. We have so much damn content on the website, so if you really want to better yourself, you really want to climb, you gotta go check it out in the links down below. But without further ado, let's jump into the video. Now we gotta start it off with your favorite insta-lockers, the duelists. And even if you're not a duelist main yourself, send this video to a buddy duelist main so that he stops making these 3 huge freaking mistakes. The first mistake that duelist players are making in many ranks is the psycho entry always. Now I understand that duelists are supposed to be the one that entry onto a site. That is 100% true. That being said, that doesn't mean they blindly Leroy Jenkins this hoe. There are many ways to set up an engagement to be more successful. Imagine you're a character like Phoenix, right? You can throw a molly in one corner and flush at an enemy. You can set up a flame wall in another. You can gather information about how many enemies are on site and what utility they have, and you can bait out precious utility like alarm bot and cipher traps. There's so many different things that you can do, and sometimes they don't take a lot of time, but you should do them first before you execute really hard onto a point. And if you're just psycho running into these things, you're not going to be getting any control of the point. You're just going to be dying, and you're never going to be an effective space creator. On top of that, it's also your call a big percentage of the time to decide, hey, maybe we should just back up and leave, because you're going to have a little bit more sound cues than your allies. You're going to be on the front line so you can see how many enemies are there. You see 2, 3 people there. You realize that there's way too many of the enemy that already have rotated. Ultimately, you can make the call and say, hey, let's just not commit at all. Let's go rotate to a different point. And a lot of times you should be doing this in your games. Now moving on to the next big mistake that duelist players make all the damn time, and it's being too aggressive on defense. Now we all know that playing aggressive on defense could get you a lot of value, but it works much better when you're unpredictable. One of the big things that you do not want to risk is pushing up aggressively, having an enemy play default, and then them punish you, and you leave a really precious hole in the defense, not just for holding, but for information as well. Something that you really need to consider is that as long as you're alive, retaking a point is possible as a duelist, but if duelists push up and die early, it is very difficult for controllers and sentinels to retake a site alone because they don't have any means to take space, just like you would when you're on attack. When you're taking a point, you still need that for a retake scenario. So yes, you can mix up some aggressive pushes on defense all over here and there, but don't get overly predictable and realize that defaulting to a more passive playstyle, especially when things aren't going well for you, is the best way to give your teammates an actual shot in a retake, which is really good. Now the third big mistake that duelist players are making is they're not taking into account the position of their allies. Now yes, when you are playing a duelist, you're trying to get picks, take space, and push onto point, take site control. But we all know that you're not always going to be able to go onto site somewhere and kill everyone on site, especially if there's multiple people. But you always want to set yourself up in a scenario where it's easy for your allies to refrag. If you're pushed up so far ahead of your allies that there's no possible way for them to refrag, then you really set the enemy team up for a free kill and a get out. This really commonly happens with specifically characters that have a form of mobility like Jet and Raze. Yes, you can use your mobility to catch the enemy off guard, but you gotta make sure that if you don't initially catch them off guard, you don't just keep using that momentum to push further and further into the enemy team when the enemies know where you are and you didn't get any value, because that's a really easy shutdown and your allies are never going to be in position to refrag that. So it's a really good idea to keep in mind where your allies are, what their LOS is, and can they refrag you if you get swung on depending on where you're positioning. Nothing's wrong with playing aggressive, but if you're going to be playing overly aggressive, coordinate that to your team before you do so. Then we're going to the next big role that we got for you in this video, and it's the Initiator. Now, the first big mistake that Initiator players are doing all the time, and it's getting really predictable with setups, specifically rollouts and flashes. So let's talk about a character like Sova, right? Yes, there's a lot of recon rollouts that you can learn, a lot of shock rollouts that you can learn, and these can be incredibly effective, but you got to remember that once you use a rollout, whether it's a recon or a flash, especially if you use it more than once, the enemies are going to be ready and waiting for it. It doesn't matter if that recon is the perfect setup to actually cover the entire site if the enemy is literally pre-aiming where the recon is going to show up. This also happens the same way with flashes. If you're playing a character like Breach or Sky, if you flash in the exact same way every single time, the enemies are going to get wise to it. They're going to realize there's a pattern, and they're going to better prepare themselves to counteract that, whether that means positioning in a way that doesn't get exposed to that flash angle, or being ready to turn/shoot the flash so that they can quickly make a counterplay. You got to make sure that as an Initiator, you're putting pressure on the enemy, but the pressure is not the same type of pressure every single time, because enemies are going to come up with a countermeasure for you, and as a result, all your duelists are going to die because they're relying on your setup to go take site control. Now, the second big mistake that Initiators are making, especially at the lower ranks, is they're submitting themselves to potential damage and swings when they're using their utility. You got to make sure that you're fully safe and that you are ready to cancel your utility at any time. Something that you should typically get in the habit of doing is not going into your utility until you're either safe by teammates or you have the angle that can swing the angle you're holding actually clear. So enemies would actually have to make noise if they wanted to full swing you, and that basically means that you will not get swung on while you're using your utility, and you never want to be using like a drone or setting up for some flash with Breach or whatever the case may be and then get swung on and die. It's incredibly important to make sure that you value your life and that you're positionally safe before you execute a lot of these abilities. And then the third thing that kind of relates, and it's very important, and it's not utilizing your full kit as an Initiator. A lot of people ask me generally, what do they need to work on in order to climb in Valorant? And I always say gunplay, but when Initiators ask me, hey, what do I need to work on as an Initiator to become a better Initiator? And it's all about timing your abilities. Check out a player like Sinatra, right, who loves to play Sova. Does he ever get killed when he's using a recon or a shock? Basically, hardly ever, even when he uses it in the middle of the fight. And that's because he understands when enemies are zoning away, when enemies are reloading, and the timing involved with every single one of these. He's never afraid to use his kit. In fact, he uses it to the utmost extent, and that's what you need to be learning. You need to be pushing the bounds when you're trying to learn an Initiator. You don't want to be so afraid to use your abilities that you never whip them out mid-fight or in an optimal scenario, and the only way you're going to learn proper timing is by trial and error. So go out there, try to use your abilities. Whenever you get killed, when you're trying to use an ability, ask yourself why, ask yourself if you could have repositioned, ask yourself if you actually did it a little bit too slow. If you really push yourself through trial and error, that's the best way to get really comfortable with your kit, and you're going to be using it in the middle of fights, and you're not going to be getting killed while you're using your utility. So definitely, this is a very important one. Then we're going to the next role that we got for you in this video, and it's none other than the controllers. Now, the first big mistake that controller players are making is they're too slow with defensive smokes or setup smokes. And what I mean by that is, as a controller, you already know your jobs, right? You're supposed to smoke off certain angles when you're on attack, and you're supposed to smoke off choke points when enemies are rushing on defense to prevent them from just rushing on incredibly quickly. Well, here's the thing that you need to learn how to do right away. You need to learn how to do this incredibly quickly. Whether you're Omen or Brimstone, speed matters, and a couple of seconds can mean the difference between putting that smoke up before the enemy rush on and not putting that smoke up in time to where the enemies just get to take site control for free. Essentially, there's a really tiny margin for error here, and on top of being quick, you need to be consistent. You can't have little gaps in your smoke because you're trying to go too fast. So this is something that you really need to practice. Speed matters. You need to act right away, and a great thing that you can do is hold a center point of the map on defense, because then you get better sound cues of where enemies are pushing or rushing, and you have less distance to travel. Whether you're actually planting a Brimstone smoke or you're planting an Omen smoke, it's going to be a lot easier for you to set that up. So definitely keep that in mind. This is one of the things that every high-level controller player needs to do. They need to do this very quickly, so learn it now, and it's going to set yourself up for success in the future. Now, the next big mistake that controller players make, basically period, and it's just dying early. It's pretty simple, but it's really important. Controllers should rarely be lurking unless they've already executed a certain amount of smoke-based abilities, like Omen could after he uses his smokes to help his team, or his teammates are entering onto a site and he wants to lurk to get some cutoff kills. That's fine if he already used his smokes to secure them onto site. Now, peeking op angles is very important that you don't do as well. You can never get killed first. This is very, very important. If you ever get killed first before you use those smokes to get your teammates onto site, you are going to be throwing the game outright. So just make sure that you understand that there's a responsibility on your shoulders and it's a responsibility to live. But moving on to the third big mistake that controller players make, and it's not using your smokes to help your allies. A lot of times an ally will be stuck in a tricky or really difficult to get out of scenario, but you have an LOS block ability that is almost always worth it if you can get your teammate out safely. As a controller, you should really be paying attention to your allies as a whole, making sure that you're helping enabling them and deciding ultimately when you should rotate off or execute on a site, because you have the smokes which are necessary to push any point if you have them at the very least. Now, another thing that you could be doing on defense is aggressively smoking for your duelists. Like I've given the example many times, which is like the defense haven window smoke. This is also very good if the enemy starts to slow play. If the enemy is slow playing too much, like they're not committing to a site, they're obviously playing default, you could put extra pressure on the enemies by using strategic smokes aggressively, where now they have to play around duelists even when they're just fighting for default control. So these are a lot of different things that you could do on a controller to really help your duelists and just provide more value overall. Now moving on to the last rule that we got for you in this video, and it's the Sentinel rule, last but certainly not least. But kicking it off with the first big mistake on Sentinels, and it's similar to the Initiator tip, but it's all about predictable setups. Now, turrets and trapwires in particular need to have mix-ups a lot of the time. You never want your turrets or your traps to get cleared out with utility for free. Now, I'm not saying that you can just use one type of utility spot one time and then never again, but you always got to keep the enemy guessing, because if the enemy can like use 2 shock darts to destroy all your utility, even if they don't see it because you keep putting it in the same spot, that's something that they're going to start doing. But if you're mixing up where you're putting it, then they can't always do that because it will be a waste of their utility. So that's just something that you need to understand. Be unpredictable, and that's just going to be a way that you're just going to get more value with your utility on average. Now, the next thing that you need to do on a Sentinel, and it's being consistent with an anti-flank. This is a big mistake that a lot of Sentinels do. They'll be playing one site, or they'll push one site, and they'll have anti-flank for that site, but then they rotate off that site and they never re-pick up their utility and reposition it. And sometimes you need a little bit of foresight, especially with something like Killjoy Turret, because you need that little bit of time to get it back. So just make sure that no matter where you're gonna move, whether you're gonna rotate from C to A or to mid or wherever, you're taking that utility with you and you're resetting it up to be optimal. Because another thing is, especially for a character like Cypher, the wires that are impossible to jump over from one angle or in one direction are typically possible to jump over from the other direction. So if you don't mix them up depending on where the enemy could possibly come from, then you might be having inefficient trap wires that enemies could just avoid altogether. We'll go to the GameLeap website in the links down below for in-depth advanced guides, tips and tricks, and VOD reviews over every single character so that you can easily climb the ladder. Do yourself a favor, check it out right now. But thank you so much for coming to the video. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know down below what type of intros you want to see. But that's all I got for you today. I'm Coach Mills, and I'll see you tomorrow.